Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first talk of February. And today we have Freja Knudsen, Freja Hogo Knudsen with us. And Freja is going to present the results of some of the work she did a few months ago or a year ago, over a period of months, on perceptions of voices for telecinema. And she will tell us about the role of dialect, pitch, and articles. And Freya did her BA and MA at Aarhus University, and I know you've always been fascinated by story building and the use of linguistic variation. So this is one of Freya's main research passions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So we have a presentation today on the perceptions of voices for telecinema, the role of dialect, pitch, and articles. Firstly, with the voices in telecinema from a more theoretical standpoint, um, we this it's obvious when you're watching telecinema, so movies and television, that that characters do not speak the same. And if you then go in and look at some of their actors who are voicing these or playing these characters, you can also quickly see that it is not necessarily the variation found between actors, so their vernacular, that determine how a character speaks. Um, at a space level, linguistic variation exists in telecinema to sort of like make the audience able to distinguish between characters and also to produce some effect on their viewers. Um, this effect can vary, and that is some of the things we'll be looking at today. Um, Research on linguistic productions of telecinema, so looking at how actual characters in telecinema speaks, has found some patterns. For example, that foreign dialects are often used for villains or humor, and that funny Russian characters omit articles, and that the pragmatic marker like is primarily used by young female characters. So we see these sort of patterns in telecinema. And that is because a character's voice is used as a tool to convey information. It can be just fact sheet information, so like where they're from, how old are they, but it can also be more subtle nuances about like their inner character or the plot function they have within the narrative. So it is a tool just like any other aspect of telecinema is, such as cutting, angles, music, the mise en scène, the colors of the wardrobe, etc. Bridgerton is playing right now on Netflix, and that is one of the series where people are keenly aware that they use colors to make it easier to distinguish each family of the ton, so the audience can more quickly discern where they are in the narrative. But the voice is also such a tool, even if the producers are not consciously aware of it. But that they use voices to say something about the character is extremely obvious when a previously thought good character is suddenly revealed as the villain. One example of that is, why is this not working? Oh, there we go. Is the Meep from Doctor Who. I don't have the sound clip here, but you can see screenshots. So over here we have the Meep just before it's revealed as the actual villain of the episode. It's meek, it's huddled, it's furry and cuddly, and the hands are all in like a position of protection. And its voice is also very meek and scared and very high pitched. And it's just talking about how it just wants a friend. Then it is revealed that it's actually the Meep is a war criminal out to destroy everyone in the universe. Suddenly we have these reddish eyes before they are a bit brown yellowish, but they have this red tint. We have claw-like hands, and we have even the ears are more sort of like hard to look at. Um, and its voice becomes hoarser, more assertive, and its minimum pitch is much lower than before. And it even has this stereotypical evil laugh. And if you go in and look at all of these characters that exist in telecinema, were actually evil from start to finish, but were sort of hiding for a good portion of their narrative, you will see these changes in both like angles, lighting, facial expressions, but also certainly in voice. Um, when we want to study if these changes actually has an effect on the audience, we need to do perception studies, because just observing the patterns indicates, but it does not necessarily mean that listeners evaluate the linguistic features accordingly to these observed patterns. So even though we have found a pattern that the pitch might change when the character is revealed as evil, we can't necessarily assume that audiences evaluate this lower pitch as more evil. And since the world of pop culture is different from the real world, we have some descriptions of characters that we can't really use for people in real life. We can't go around calling most people villains or heroes. We need to look into stuff that is, we can't assume that we can use their ordinary perception studies, those that just evaluate people in real life and authentic speech, especially since when we consider like indexical fields and indexes, the setting and medium is a part of the indexical field. So even like the genre of telecinema can potentially have an effect. So there's like a gap in literature in general where we need to have these perception studies within telecinema or within pop culture. We do have some, which is very nice. So we have one just from last year, looking at Critical Role, their stuff from there, who found that their participants, when they listened, their moral evaluations of a character often aligned with their actual role they have had, that they could track in their narrative. And that role was also found to be linked with pitch dynamism, such that the lower pitch dynamism is associated with overtly evil characters. And in the same sort of like vein, we have a perception study on the characters from Zootopia, I think is their English one, Zootopia or Zootropolis, where we have this character who turns evil throughout, and they found that the voice was evaluated vastly differently according to whether or not it was a sample from before she was revealed as a villain or after she was revealed as a villain. These two studies have the thing in common that they are using samples from pop culture, so speech extracted from these movies or podcast style recordings. So the content of the speech differed. And as was stated in one of them, we have that an aggressive message will obviously add to a perceived aggressiveness. So what I found that there was need for was a perception study within like the setting of telecinema with the same speech content. So it was their para-linguistic stuff that was targeted. And I decided to look at dialect articles and pitch for the study I did for my master thesis. Since I had found that these things had been previously found to exist in like these sort of patterns. So as stated before, like foreign dialects, I seemingly use for villains of humor in telecinema, but no one has really studied whether or not just listening to these voices will trigger the same sort of like evaluations as we would expect from their patterns in pop culture. Likewise, article omissions have been found to be used for comic relief. So that is both like humor and a sort of incompetence. Um, while pitch, of course, with this pitch dynamism, seems to relate to the moral alignment of a character, with lower pitch dynamism linked to being evil. Since I wanted the same speech or content of speech, I used samples from Speech Accent Archive with an American, Danish, English, German, and Russian speaker. And when I say English, it's like English, English, just to have sort of a different variety of speakers who are both native speakers of English and non-native speakers of English. To yeah, these samples, they were of course from different speakers, which is potentially a problem. I will discuss this later. But just to sort of do a little bit of control, each sample was altered to obtain roughly the same mean pitch, as this is something that could also influence evaluations. And then to have these differences in articles and pitch, I made 4 different conditions. You can see them down here. So I had the original static pitch and then a more dynamic pitch. And I crossed that with having the articles present and then removing the articles. So I found a mean pitch for each sample. Then for every pitch point that was above the mean pitch, I increased it by 12.5%. For every pitch point that was below, I decreased it by 12.5% to get a more dynamic pitch. And then I removed the article omissions by just cutting at 0 crossings. And each sound file was then just for myself. The listeners later on would not be able to see it. But it was giving a code, so a letter corresponding to the dialect, and then a number according to which condition it was. You can see them here, but they will also be on the relevant pages because there are a lot of conditions or files that to go through. The study itself, since their speech wasn't extracted from telecinema or pop culture, I had to sort of like create this telecinema world or context anyway. So this was conducted through an online survey, and participants were instructed throughout, so in the beginning, but also on each and every sound page file, to consider the stimuli as if they were a casting director, and they had for an action movie, and they had to decide on what kind of character this voice would be used as. Participants provided their normal background information at the beginning of the survey, so their age, gender, their L1, any L2s they might have, their sexuality, and their education. And at the end, they also gave information about their media habits, such as how often they watch telecinema, what genre they like, how often they watch action telecinema, whether they watch with subtitles, etc. All sort of different stuff. Each stimulus was presented separately, so it had its own page, and then it was rated on 7 parameters from 1 to 7, with their terms written at 1 and 7, so they knew like what the scale was. So I had a hero villain parameter, main character, background character, competent, incompetent, often involved in on-screen romance and or sexual activity, or never involved in on-screen romance and or sexual activity, straight, not straight, often providing comic relief or never providing comic relief, and a very strong accent to no accent. These 7 parameters was necessary before I could go on to the next page, as was providing a type-in answer as to the nationality of the speaker. But participants could choose to leave like their additional notes field empty if they choose. So that was just if they had something more to say. In the end, I ended up having 55 participants. 34 of those completed the entire survey. Since I had attrition throughout, and the order of presentation of sound files was random, but was the same for all participants due to survey exact. But you can see down here how many people, the sample size for each sound file. So of course we have like the American speaker, the Danish speaker, English speaker, German speaker, Russian speaker. My participants were age 20 to 55. I had 39 female participants, 13 male participants, and 3 who did not identify as either female nor male. 40 of these participants had Danish as their native language, and 8 of the remaining 15 participants reported Danish as an L2. So basically, Danish is extremely overrepresented in the study, which might have screwed with some results, but it is what it is. Yeah, I cleaned the data. I sorted the type in answers. And then I made some violent plots, which you will see in a moment. And I used this backward selection process with a significance level of 10%, where basically I started with a full model. So I included all of the independent variables. And then I step by step removed one of them if at least one still was above the significance level. And then I ended up with a final model that only had like the potentially significant independent variables still in it. Yeah, so to the results. For the main character rating, I can start with explaining this over here. You should be able to up here see just their information on their naming of the sound files to make it a bit more easy to understand. But we have the ratings for each sound file along the x-axis, and then their actual rating on the y-axis from main down, being a main character down at 1, up to being a background character at 7. You can see their actual votes, their small colored dots in here, and then their sort of shape of the distribution. The violins are not that great because they're sort of squished together, but you might get a little bit of a feel for it as well. And then we have the mean rating in black, along with the standard deviation for each sound file. Visually, let's start with this actually. Doing the statistics, I found the final model to depend on their speaker L1, the pitch, and how frequently the listener consumed telecinema. Specifically, it was found that American English were the most main character voices, and that static pitch affected towards the voice being rated as more of a main character, and that also often when the listener often watched telecinema, they were also more likely to vote it as a main character. Looking at it, we can see it as well that we have like their English and American rather low, so down towards a main character. Whereas especially like the German character or the German speaker over here is quite high, so it's more of a background character. There is something strange happening for A3 here. So they're dynamic and present, dynamic pairs with present articles for the American speaker. And I don't know what that could be, especially since this is not an effect we see in the others. The others, like their third condition for the others, do not follow the same pattern of being more of a background character. So what exactly is going on here? I don't know. But the overall pattern of the native speakers of English being more main characters do fit with, for example, Libby Green's claim that especially American is used as sort of their standard. So you might have more main characters, yeah, with native dialects. When we move on to the hero rating, we again find that the final model depended on the L1 of the speaker and the frequency of telecinema consumption, but also how often people specifically watch action telecinema. Yeah, and looking at this, and also just considering their numbers from the final model, Russian is definitely a villain. That is the rating they were most often given, while the others are rather close to each other, just differing by like 1 point of vote. And if people often watch telecinema, they were more likely to think a voice was a hero, whereas if they often watch action telecinema, they were more likely to think of a voice as a villain. Visually, we can see this effect of dialect, especially for the Russian, who has very few votes down here at hero, but is very much centered up near being a villain. And then, yeah, we don't really see that much difference for the others. Though notably, Danish is quite low, so quite near being a hero, which is strange considering the idea that foreign dialects in general is for villains. This Danish rating goes against that, while the German rating is leaning villain-like, though not overwhelmingly so. Then I had the competence rating. Again, their final model depended on the L1, but also an article, the listener's L1, the frequency of telecinema consumption, the frequency of action telecinema consumption, and subtitling habits. So they, according to their model, American and English were the most competent. If articles were omitted, the speaker were rated as more incompetent, and non-Danish listeners rated in general more competent. Visually, when we look at this here, we do see that for the non-native speakers, so the Danish, the German, and the Russian, their conditions with omitted articles, so 2, 4, are rated as more incompetent. So we can see 2 and 4 being higher than 1 and 3. This trend is also seen over here for the German and for the Russian. However, that is not really the case for the English or the American speakers, where they are really rather level. There. But for their non-native speakers of English, omitting articles seems to negatively affect their perceived competence level. And then, since we had an effect of the listener L1, that is basically just whether or not they were Danish, because I didn't have that many non-Danes that I could account for differences in L1, apart from is it Danish, yes or no. But looking at Danish participants compared to the non-Danish participants, it's especially fun to see that how like Danish participants are rating the Danish speaker as more incompetent than their non-Danish participants are. So they are far more lenient on the Danish speaker. And generally the non-Danish participants rate the native speakers as more incompetent than their Danish speakers do. So seemingly their Danish speaker or the Danish listeners are very keen on native speakers of English and not so keen on non-native speakers. And I had a romance rating. The final model depended on their L1 of the speaker, the pitch, the listener's gender, their sexuality, the listener's L1, and then the frequency of action telecinema consumption, their media knowledge, and their linguistic knowledge, which is basically whether or not they had an education within media and or linguistics. And it was found that German and Russians were unlikely to be involved in romance. And if the pitch was dynamic, it was also less likely to be involved in romance. And women, straight people, and non-Danes were all more likely to rate towards a voice being involved in romance. And actually also often consuming action telecinema was also rating towards often being involved in romance. As was having an education in media. You were also like, oh yeah, surely they're part of a romance plot. Whereas an education in linguistics resulted in ratings that were towards not being involved in romance and or sexual activity. Yep, if we look at it just visually, we do see a slight effect of like article emissions going up against like if you omit your articles, you are less likely to be involved in romance. But this effect is not strong enough that it was part of the final model. Yeah, except for again, we have something going on with A3 that is a bit off compared to the rest. So there might have been something with that voice. Yeah, and then there's static. So 1 and 2 for the Germans also, we don't see the effect of omitted articles for that, but we do sort of like see it for many of the other speakers. Then there's the sexuality question. And it also depended on their L1 of the speaker, the pitch, the listener's age, the gender, the sexuality, and then the frequency of telecinema and action telecinema, their subtitling happens, and their media knowledge. And English was very much not straight, while German was somewhat not straight. A static pitch was rated as more straight than a dynamic pitch. And women, straight people, and older people were all more likely to rate towards not straight. Often consuming telecinema affected ratings towards straight, and often consuming action telecinema had the opposite effect, so towards not straight. And often, like an education in media resulted in ratings towards not straight. So just looking at here, we see it is rather level. It's around 3 for most of them, except the English speaker who was continuously rated as more not straight, so to say. Yeah. Then we have comic relief, one of my favorites. Again, just their speaker L1, the pitch, the articles, media knowledge, and linguistic knowledge. So we have not providing comic relief up here and often providing comic relief down here. The final model found that Americans provide little comic relief and the others are somewhat level. It was also found that the dynamic pitch provides more comic relief and that omitted articles provide more comic relief. And that both an education in media and in linguistics resulted in ratings towards more comic relief. Yeah. But we see this, yeah, basically like visually, it's very hard to see any trends. It seems rather level, but we do have this model saying that there should be some effect. Then there's the degree of accents, depending, and the final model found that it depended on their speaker L1, the article, the listener's gender, their sexuality, their frequency of action telecinema consumption, media knowledge, and linguistic knowledge. And basically, the American had less accent and the Russian the most. And omitting articles resulted in a rating towards a stronger accent. And education in media affected towards their being rated as no accent, while an education in linguistics affected towards having a strong accent, which is unsurprising, I think, because linguists are told rather early on that everybody has an accent. So they are probably not keen on voting that somebody does not have an accent. So I think that is expected. When we look at the data visually, it's only like Russian that is strikingly different from the rest. They are very close to a strong accent, whereas the others are more towards the middle. And where we see for most of the other speakers, there is a trend of omitted articles resulting in a stronger accent. But visually, when we look at the Russian speaker over here, we see that condition 2 and 4, so the omitted articles, are actually rated towards less of an accent. Still like very heavenly accented, but less so than when the accents are present, which is fun since for all of these 5 speakers, Russian is the only one for whom their speech in English is usually or stereotypically associated with article omissions. Yeah, and then people had to write in the nationality of a speaker, and just to see like how well they were able to sort of deduce where the accent was from or where the speaker was from. All type-in answers were either sorted as accurate, close, or incorrect, depending on whether or not they were an exact match to the actual speaker L1, so whether they had put American, Danish, English, German, or Russian. They were sorted as close if the answer was in the same like regional zone as the country of the speaker's origin. And that was according to the United Nations GEO scheme, with the exception that because Danish and English is actually in the same GEO scheme, if I'm remembering correctly. But English was just sorted as like British. Also, if people put like Irish and Scottish or something. So just like the Isles, the British Isles. Yeah, and as you can see here, participants really struggled with identifying the German speaker. We have like the colored bars are both the accurate and close ratings, whereas the dotted line here indicates the level of the accurate type-in answers. So you can see that for most of the speakers, those two are somewhat close together, but that is not the case for the English speaker, because a lot just put British, and that is just a close rating rather than an accurate one. Yeah, and then the American speaker was harder for people to identify in the dynamic conditions, so 3 and 4 down here. Yeah, but this one is also very fun to look at for the Danish participants versus the non-Danish participants, especially regarding the rating or their accuracy regarding the Danish speaker, because Danish participants were really good at detecting the Danish speaker. But the non-Danish participants, not as much. They were around 50%. The Danish speakers were also a bit better at identifying their German speaker, but still not impressively so, just a tiny bit better than the non-Danish participants. And then, since there seems to be this trend of like being better at identifying a speaker of your same nationality, I looked into whether or not I could do the same for some of the other speakers. I did have two German participants. They were accurate 50% of the time and correct 75% of the time, for a total of 8 ratings. So they were very much better. They would be up here for the German rating than the other participants. And but of course, it's not a big enough sample size to say anything for certain, but it does seem to match what we see here. And the same, I had 3 English participants. Don't know specifically what type of English, whether it's British, Australian, American. I don't have that information, unfortunately. But if we look at the American and English speaker together, then for those, or actually, yeah, they were accurate around 50% of the time for the English speaker and correct 100% of the time. So they were rather good, better than the others. And for the American speaker, they were even better. So they were accurate 90% of the time and correct 100% of the time. I didn't have any Russian participants, so I don't know how they would fare. But it does indicate that people are better at identifying speakers with the same L1 as them. Yeah, but that was a lot of graphs, and it's a bit hard to sort of like keep in mind all of it. So just to sum up, so the effects of dialect is I found that the dialect affected all observed parameters when looking at the final model. However, it is worth noting that I only had one speaker for each dialect, so changes to the dialect is also changes in speaker. So even though I did control for the mean F0, there are still other differences. So this dialect effect, we cannot be sure that it's actually targeting dialect and that it's not something different with the speaker that is being that people react to. So the study would really benefit from like either having multiple speakers for each dialect, having one speaker who are able to do multiple dialects, or maybe use AI voices. I think AI is getting to a point where that is potentially something one could do. Don't quite know how I feel about it, but that is potentially something one could look into. Notably, on the hero parameter, that is one of the places we would expect a dialect to have an effect, due to prior research suggesting that a foreign dialect affects towards being a villain. We do see that for the Russian German speakers, but not for the Danish speaker. And that could be due to their high number of Danish participants, but also that the non-Danish participants, since more than half of them have reported Danish as an L1, or it's not, sorry, an L2, that does indicate that they are probably in Denmark or have some sort of relation to Denmark, as Danish is not a typical L2 to choose to just do on Duolingo. So there could be something screwing with the results there. Prior research also suggests, so with the patterns in telecinema, that a strong foreign dialects provides humor. But while we did see that the American speaker was rated as providing little comic relief, the others were rather level, even the English speaker. So we did not find like strong evidence for this. Looking at pitch then, it affected some of the parameters, but not all of them. So it was main character, romance, sexuality, comic relief that we saw an effect in. Notably, there was no effect on the hero parameter as we would have expected, since prior research suggests that a dynamic pitch is linked with friendliness, or that a restricted pitch is linked with evilness. But perhaps like this friendliness is not closely associated with being a hero, so there could be something in the terminology used. But it could also be that, of course, I have made the pitch more dynamic, but perhaps it should have been made less so. So it should have been restricted rather than sort of like made more dynamic. So that could potentially have yielded results. But yeah. Then in the end, we have articles. They affected competence, they affected comic relief, and the degree of accent. And these findings are pretty much in alignment with their pattern that comic relief characters, at least Russian comic relief characters, omit articles, and that these characters like can be described as like idiots or incompetent. Because we see that omitted articles affects towards a speaker being rated as more incompetent and as towards providing more comic relief. These findings are also kind of in alignment with the idea that humor is provided by contrast to other characters, for example, through a strong dialect and ungrammaticalities, because we see articles affecting the degree of accent, but also like these humorous elements. Yeah, cool. And then I have the literature used here. Yes, that was all for me.